So that the question of a republic is very much based upon the subject of law. Okay? Now, it's interesting that the most dramatic case of attempting to base a nation on law was the American Republic. That up until that time, there was, kings and all sorts of different forms of government. But in 1776, and certainly in 1783, but in 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, the basis of the American Republic was stated forcefully. We said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator, not by other men, but by their Creator, with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, that it's precisely the study of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which were given to all men and women, is the basis of law, is the basis of government. And that any other attempt in history to base it on the will of a majority, the will of a minority, or just plain stupidity, anarchy, right, failed dramatically, and failed in the, and of course the implications for relative potential population density were disaster. So you cannot have a republic without a citizenship that understands natural law. There is no other basis. It does not matter opinion, it does not matter power, it does not matter anything, but that that the population understands and is capable of communicating in literate language, as Shelley would say, passionate conceptions with respect to man and nature. Because you cannot have a republic, by the way, without literate language. Because that's how you develop your laws, right? They're constantly developing. Now, in direct contrast to this idea of government, there was another way that people have attempted to rule throughout history. And that is the question of populism. Right? Now, what is populism? And I think people know populists, right? They do not appeal to law. They appeal to emotion. They appeal to prejudice. They appeal to opinion. And that the basis of all populists is rhetoric, right? And in fact, Plato hated the school of rhetoric. That his big polemic was against the school of rhetoric. Because this kind of eloquence based upon prejudice was one of the most dangerous tools that individuals had. Now, where does populism come from? I mean, in other words, we're going at this. I'll go through the history of it, but I want you to get the conceptual basis of it. Populism comes specifically from Aristotle. And so does rhetoric come from Aristotle. And I know you've been discussing, and I suspect you have been discussing this question of Plato versus Aristotle. You probably had a class on that or something like that. Many classes, I suspect. Now, Aristotle is one of the most evil thinkers in history. Because what he proposed, as you have heard, and I'll just reference in this discussion, what Aristotle proposed was that while there may be God, in fact, he said there was God, that because we are finite and God is infinite, there is no intelligible way that man can understand with his use of his own ability to think, can understand the nature of God and the nature of the universe. That what we can do is study what we see, but we cannot study the lawful order of causation, of a causality in the universe. We cannot know that because our intellect is finite and God's intellect who created it is infinite. And on the basis of that, we cannot know the laws of the universe. The only thing we can know is sense perception, and the only thing we can know is not what causes things, but correlations, right? Correlations of things that happen. Therefore, mankind is incapable of knowing what creates things, therefore is incapable of understanding the laws of the universe. The only ones who can understand the laws of the universe, according to Aristotle, are the elect, are those who were given supernatural powers to speak directly to the spirits of the universe. Because since there was no intelligible way of approaching the problem of knowledge, then but yet things do change. You see that things change and you don't understand why. You had to have a priesthood who were endowed with special powers to do that kind of thing. This, by the way, was the cult of Apollo at Delphi, right? This cult priesthood was the only ones who could intercede for man with God. Okay? And this elect, were the only ones capable of ruling. The other aspect of Aristotle, which was totally noxious, is the idea that God, since he's infinite, doesn't really cause anything in the physical universe. Because he's infinite, the physical universe is finite, and if God causes anything in the universe, he would be finite, and therefore God cannot cause anything in the universe. Therefore the physical universe is evil, which is the basis of all Gnostic belief. That this is what we call Gnosticism, this is what we call cultism, this is what we call Cathars, right? The Cathars, right? But they come from, at least in the modern time, and when I say modern, I'm talking about 2,500 years ago in written history. I mean, you can date this back to Shakti, Shiva, you can date it back many thousands of years, even before Aristotle codified it, right? But this is where all the cult beliefs, the basis of all cult beliefs, is the idea that God is not causal in the universe. And therefore, but yet, since things do change, you do have an elect, and you believe that the physical universe is evil. It must be, because there's no causality. It's not rational. It's merely correlative. You can correlate things. If 99 times I push a rock and it goes X distance, right, you expect 100th time that will happen. But you don't know why. Right? All right, now, therefore the basis of populism is this cult belief in the unintelligibility of the universe and the need for an elect, a small elite, to tell the people what is going on, right? Otherwise, if there is no truth, which, by the way, in the modern time we call Satanism, right? If there is no truth, then what are we doing here? If you cannot know the truth, why are you here? It's absurd, which, by the way, is the basis of all Satanism and evil. Right? Which is the reductio ad absurdum, is what the Frankfurt School in the modern time taught. After World War I, people became very demoralized when they saw that millions of people marched to their death in seemingly no purpose to the thing. And they said in the cafes of Germany and other places, they sat around and they said, God's dead, out of pure cultural pessimism. They said, God is dead. That's where the God is dead movement came from. They said God would not have allowed this to happen if he was alive. right? And that's where you get this Satanism and the descent into pure hell, right? Which is what the modern era, has promulgated. Even Aristotle would have disagreed with that. He would have said, at least there's correlation. These guys said there's no correlation. Everything is absurd. But anyway, we are going at the core, at the essence of what it means to be human. Because to be human is a rejection of these cult beliefs. To be human, as Lyndon LaRouche has defined it, and we're talking about the difference between human and beast, which should be the basis for government, is that human beings do affect the laws of the universe, as you've learned through Christian economy. And we only know we don't know through correlation. We know that we've affected the laws of the universe to the extent, as Genesis tells us, that we have increased and multiplied and were fruitful. That we know our knowledge, not as particular knowledge, but the overall effect of our knowledge is such that the overall relative potential population density has increased because of what we did. Whereas we don't know directly the laws of the universe because we can't step outside of the universe and look at it the way God looks at it. But we know it through change. We know the universe because we've affected successful change in the universe. Therefore, our knowledge is coherent with the laws of the universe. Otherwise, you would not have successful change. You would have a decrease in the relative potential population density. So you do not know facts. You know an array of knowledge, a geometry, such that by affecting that geometry, you change your ability to be fruitful and multiply. But you do not know facts. The idea, and only this cult stuff, tells you you know facts. What you know is causality. That's what you know. You know it as becoming. And you know the becoming as, if it is fruitful, you will have a certain effect on the universe. That is the basis for government. If you attempt to found government without natural law, without an explicit understanding of natural law, which Plato and others were implicit, but now with Lynn, we have the most explicit statement in history of natural law. Therefore, we can have the best, most clear government in the history of mankind. And it is not by accident that an American would be the person who would find this. Because in the modern time, this idea of humanity in terms of a republic, explicitly a republic based on law, although I must say America is not what it was. But it is interesting, and it is very interesting. Lynn writes his own history about this. But I remember being so startled, it never occurred to me that, my God, the Constitution is based upon natural law. I mean, it never occurred to me. I just thought it was a body of laws, right? But that it was directly informed by implicit, as Hamilton makes it was the best in terms of articulating it, what we call economics, or American system economics, is based upon an idea of natural law. It was also interesting that an economist would discover this again, right? It was understood by Leibniz, but again, Leibniz was totally suppressed, and therefore was rediscovered. So therefore what we have is, and the reason I'm going through this is because you will never understand what the issues are in populism unless you understand it from this standpoint. Now, how do we get to the point, well, I mean, how did populism occur in the modern time? Because it goes way back. But there's a very specific institutions that brought these populist ideas into the English-speaking world. And that's what I'm going to be discussing now. In other words, how was it that we came to the impasse that we have such lousy politicians and a population which understands nothing about this? What were the institutions that created this kind of denigration? Now, I want to start first at the height of European culture, which was the Italian Renaissance. in which the idea of natural law, based upon the ennoblement of what we call the imago viva Dei, there was a celebration in the Renaissance of the difference between man and the animal, based upon a very clear conception of, geometric conception of how man thinks and the implications of that thinking. Now, the oligarchies of Europe went crazy during the Renaissance. They said very straightforward, this cannot continue. Because if you base government on law, then these gods of Olympus, these ones who think they're above law, which is the basis of this oligarchy, they think they're above law. That since they can manipulate men, they think they can ultimately manipulate God and deny the laws of the universe, which they find they can't in wars, famines, and disease, in the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Right, comes to visit them as they continue to deny natural law. But the oligarchies of Western Europe decided that we must destroy the Renaissance. We must destroy this idea, this Platonic, Christian Platonic idea of the Renaissance. So they deployed through Venice. Now, Venice is an interesting place, one of the most evil places on this planet. Let me just give you a little quick prehistory of Venice. What you had was this Aristotelian. Remember, I'm talking about Aristotle, right? He's a Greek, right? And it was at the cult of Apollo at Delphi, which is where, in the modern time, this kind of cult Gnostic belief comes from. Well, this cult of Apollo at Delphi, when these guys win, they tend to destroy the nations, the host nations that they're in, through usury, mainly, right, and slavery. So they destroyed the very basis of their own existence. So they destroyed Greece. In fact, they made deals with the Persian Empire. Aristotle, by the way, had made a deal to bring in the Persian Empire to destroy Greece. He was actually a Persian agent, right? So after the Persian Empire destroys Greece, this cult of Apollo, cult of Delphi at Apollo, no, this cult of Apollo at Delphi, I'm sorry, they were also the banking center for all of Greece. And the way it worked is, if you wanted an oracle to say something to you, you had to give them money, right? And they would shake the dice or roll the entrails or whatever, right? And they would give you, whatever you wanted, depending on how much money. And then the woman would go crazy and shout and scream, and then the spin doctors on the side, the people watching this thing, would interpret her screams and shouts and entrails and other things, right? So much like today, by the way, in terms of the media, right? What he really meant to say was. But anyway, so this cult of Apollo at Delphi took over Rome, ancient Rome. They transplanted their money and they transplanted their power to Rome. And they took over particularly the Roman military. Now, on the basis of their taking over of Rome, of course, as St. Augustine indicates, they introduced all the cults and all the hedonistic beliefs into Rome. And on the basis of that, as usual, they destroyed Rome. So they picked up their money and they went to a place called Venice from Constantinople. They first went to Constantinople, which was back in Greece, and then they went to Venice. So that there is an unbroken, and we've documented this in great detail, there's an unbroken line of Aristotelian development from Delphi to Rome, from Rome to Constantinople under a Christian guise, right, and then from Constantinople to Venice. Okay? Taking their money. Right? And always these 100 families or so, the monies are held in what we call fondees, or funds. And the funds tend to long survive the families, right? And what you have attached to the fondee are the politicians and the lawyers and others who defend the fondee to the extent of destroying a country. Whereas they'll defend the fondee before they'll allow a country to develop, right? It's all based on usury. Wherever you find Aristotelianism, you will always find usury, always. And wherever you find cults, you'll find usury, always, as a form of government. So now, okay, so now in Venice, they did a very tricky thing. Now let me explain to you a little something about Venice and the evil we're up against. Because Venice is one of the most evil places in the world, and has been. Now, from Venice, by the way, let me just give you sort of a history, sort of a geography of this thing. As usual, they destroyed Venice, right? So from Venice, they transplanted their money into Amsterdam and Britain, using mainly, although not only, in Venice they set up a ghetto. Ghetto is a word for, an enclave, the ghetto. It's an Italian word. And they put since all the Jews in Europe were not allowed in Europe, right, because of certain crazy laws, the majority of Jews in Europe ended up in Venice, in the ghetto. And the Venetian oligarchs used the people of the ghetto, since they were allowed to have usury, and by Christian law no one else could, they used them to transplant into Amsterdam, and they used them to transplant into Britain, right? They took the Italian money, or the old money, the old wealth, the fondee, using predominantly Jewish, although not only Jewish bankers, to take this, right, and spread it around Europe, to take over Europe. This was the split between the Nuovi, which means the new houses, which were the ones who went into Amsterdam and Britain, and the Vecchi, who stayed in Venice. Right? There was a split on how to move their money and how to survive, right? Now, why do I go through this? Because what happened is, the Venetians are the trickiest adversary in history, because they can play both sides of the fence at once, and always have. The critical element of Venetian rule is they can be what's called Delphic. Isn't that interesting? Delphic. Now, what does that mean? And I'll give you some very interesting things you should read to understand the mind of the Venetians. The most famous thing you can read, or the most interesting thing you can read, is by Friedrich Schiller. It's called The Ghost Seers. If you really want to understand the nature of the enemy, read The Ghost Seers. Well, it's in our books. G-H-O-S-T-S-E-E-R-S. Ghost Seers, right? And it's an extremely intricate discussion of the Venetian mind. But what you find out through the Ghost Seers and through other writings, like Shakespeare wrote Othello about Venice. He also wrote Merchant of Venice about Venice. Probably the most devastating critique of Venice was written by a man by the name of Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe. It's in English, called The Jew of Malta, which is also about Venice, or Venetian methods, right? But what are Venetian methods? Since there is no truth, they're total chameleons. And I won't go through all the details of the Ghost Seer, but the core of you won't get it unless I give you a little hint, okay? The hint is, the way that Venice worked was that they had the Doge, who was at the top of the pyramid, and they'd have a Council of 10. Right? This Council of 10 had absolute power in Venice. And they could issue a death warrant for any reason. And every court in Venice would not prosecute if the Council of 10 issued such a death warrant. Because, you see, when you have a bunch of powerful families, if you let them just fight it out, which is what's happening in Italy all the time, there was always wars. Because everyone's so greedy, since they're not based upon any idea of natural law, everyone's so greedy, they were fighting all the time. So the only way you could keep peace among all these families, and you were only allowed, by the way, there were only 1,000 families that were allowed to have anything to do with government in Venice. Only 1,000 families. And then a little later they got another 200 more for other reasons. It's sort of a complicated story. But the only way you could keep them divided was have absolute power in the Council of Ten. I will go through the fact that Venice created the Reformation and created the Counter-Reformation. Which was the biggest devastation of religion in the history of Western Europe. We have it in detail, proof that the Venetians created the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, which is why religions are at each other's throat all the time. Because what got obscured through the whole process was the true nature of religion and the true nature of God, which was critical, because you cannot know natural law unless you know the nature of how God creates. But both sides of the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation were run by Aristotelians. Both sides. And there was a 30 years war that ensued, a religious war that ensued, based upon the Venetian manipulation of both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And if you want to know why there's such confusion in organized religion, blame it on Venice. Because that's what happened. And we have seen religious wars, and Islam, by the way, we have proof Islam was created by Aristotelians. Absolutely. The Prophet Muhammad was a trained Aristotelian. Yeah. Yes, I will, but I want to get through the general thesis, but, you know, I'll go through, let me get through the general thesis and then get back to the question period, right? But he was a Nestorian Christian. He was not, you know. So therefore, we're in a bit of a pickle here. Western civilization is in a bit of a pickle. Because unless, and it's not a question of, sure, there are great Protestants, there are great Catholics, there are great Islam people. There are, there's no question about it, men of good faith and goodwill. But unless they begin to understand what unites them on the basis of the intelligibility of the laws of the universe, the Mosaic tradition, a tradition of Catholicism based upon the teachings of Augustine and clearly Christ, and certain Islamic traditions that come out of this, Platonic Islamic traditions, because there were Islamic traditions were based on Plato, directly against Aristotle, right, in the great caliphates of Baghdad. In other words, it wasn't just all bad, otherwise it wouldn't even be here. We certainly wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have, you know, 5 billion people on this planet. I'm not trying to say everything's all bad, I'm trying to get at what's bad, and a way of intelligibly going at what is wrong, so that we don't make the same mistake again, right? Because we don't have much chance. We won't have another chance on this one, because it's getting pretty late in the game. So, what you have right now is, and let me go through it in a little bit of detail just to give you the general thesis. We've written about this, and I want everybody to read this, because it would take hours if I went through this. But at the monastery of San Giustina in Venice, the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation were plotted at the monastery, the Benedictine monastery of San Giustina, right in Venice. They were at the University of Padua, where this group of people, of Venetian oligarchical families, language, because that's how you develop your laws. right? They're constantly developing. Now, in direct contrast to this idea of government, there was another way that people have attempted to rule throughout history, and that is the question of populism. Right? Now, what is populism? And I think people know populists, right? They do not appeal to law. But in 1776, and certainly in 1783, but in 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, the basis of the American Republic was stated forcefully. We said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator, not by other men, but by their Creator, with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, that it's precisely the study of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which were given to all men and women, is the basis of law, is the basis of government. And that any other attempt in history to base it on the will of a majority, the will of a minority, or just plain stupidity, anarchy, right, failed dramatically, and failed in the, and of course the implications for relative potential population density were disaster. So you cannot have a republic without a citizenship that understands natural law. There is no other basis. It does not matter opinion, it does not matter power, it does not matter anything, but that the population understands and is capable of communicating in literate language, as Shelley would say, passionate conceptions with respect to man and nature. Because you cannot have a republic, by the way, without literate. So that the question of a republic is very much based upon the subject of law. Okay? Now, it's interesting that the most dramatic case of attempting to base a nation on law was the American Republic. That up until that time, there was, kings and all sorts of different forms of government.